Hey guys, welcome back to Project Bodybuilding. Today is going to be a quick video as we are running out of time. With just a few more days to go before the 2025 Arnold Classic, I still have several videos I want to get out, so I gotta put the pedal to the metal. Up next in our series is quite an interesting matchup. Brandon Curry joins us for another comparison in this series, and he will be going up against James Hollingshead. I really can't even begin to describe this comparison, but it's a pretty weird one, honestly. James has some flaws and Brandon is fading, let's just put it bluntly. So to say the least, it's just interesting. But let's not waste any more time and let's jump into episode 7 of the Road to the Arnold Classic series. Today, 2024 Mr. Olympia Brandon Curry will be facing 2024 Arnold Classic James Hollingshead. If you guys like these types of videos, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe for more. And I will be live all Arnold Classic weekends, so stay tuned for my live coverage. And right off the bat, what a hard choice we have, and not in a good way. Both guys are pretty flawed, especially in ways that really compound in a shot like this. And since they're both pretty flawed physiques, that means a lot of these poses will be close. For Brandon, his condition is just pitiful. I find it to be even worse in the video I'll show later, but even here you can tell he's just not up to snuff at all. Even for James, who is almost never at 100%. The other major flaw are those legs. Not only are they completely devoid of detail, they're completely devoid of any hope with that level of size. Now James is no saint. His structure is not pleasing as he's very narrow, but with him elongating his torso in this shot, it doesn't look too bad here, I suppose. I still do think Brandon, even though he's probably more flawed, still brings a lot more to like. He does have the better shape, the thicker lats, the better arms, and James is just kind of meh all around. But then again, he does have less flaws. So maybe you do want to go with James for having less flaws, or maybe you want to go with Brandon, who has more detrimental flaws, but at least more to offer. I'm actually going with the latter choice. I don't necessarily think there's a right answer here, but that's my answer. But it's going to be a very narrow win. In my comparisons, as some of you may know, I use a margin of victory point system. If the win is narrow, solid, or dominant, a competitor will get 1, 2, or 3 points for that win respectively. Poses like this, where they both have issues, they're going to be very close, and like this one, a lot of them will just be 1 point for the winner. The same points and problems that transpired in the front double remain constant here. For Brandon, his issues are about the same though. His condition sucks, but that really doesn't change pose to pose too often. It sucks just as much in the last pose as it does here. And Brandon's legs are also still small. James still has the same issues too, mainly that narrow structure, but he looks way worse here than he did in the last shot. His waist is really wide compared to his shoulders, his lats are barely wider than his waist, and the entire abdomen has zero detail. And while Brandon's lower half is pretty bad, that upper half of his is actually amazing. It used to be better, sure, but he still has a lot of his prime look. He has the full arms and delts, a thick chest packed with a lot of detail, and great lats and a very overall impressive V-taper. So as bad as half the pose is for Curry, I think because his upper half is so good and James's entire pose is so bad, I'm actually bumping this pose up from the last margin. So Brandon will surprisingly take a 2-point victory here. Finally, we can catch a break in the side chest though, as we actually have proper poses for each gentleman. These are very solid side chests. James probably takes the side leg because he's bigger and his condition is close enough to Brandon's, who is actually the more separated guy here, believe it or not. And really, Brandon's legs aren't bad from the side. So even though James probably wins, Brandon doesn't have to deal with a big lower body drop off like he did in the first 2 shots. Brandon does have the much better abs too, which is always a nice touch. He also has the much fuller delts and the thicker arms. In pecs to pecs, James is probably a little favored, but once again, Brandon is incredibly good. I really have to see these two on stage to make a definitive call on the chest. And from the overall perspective, James is bigger, but Brandon is more compact and still has a lot of that 3D effect that he used to have in his prime. He actually has more of that 3D full popping effect than James does now. Like I said, this is a very good pose for each guy, and it's close, but actually on good terms. For me, myself, I'm going with Brandon. I prefer his more compact 3D look, and he's overall more detailed. He scores another point here. But then we are right back to poor poses when we turn these guys around. The rear double used to be really good for Curry, actually. He would have no problem beating James if Brandon could actually use a version from just a few years ago, but he has deteriorated a lot. Brandon starts this pose out by first losing the lower body. James is not the most dry individual out there, but Brandon is practically walking on stilts. All James had to do to win the lower body was just to show up. He's much bigger, and with that, he's much more imbalanced with his upper half. Now for the back. The upper back on Brandon is fine. He has good traps, still in pretty good width. James's best region though is also the upper back. He's still pretty okay too. James also wins the delts because he's more peeled, and honestly he probably wins the arms too because Brandon's are deflating, and the imbalance is pretty noticeable from this angle. Both guys do end up falling off a little in the lats and lower back. Brandon does have the overall better back with minimally better showings in the lower and mid back, but I just don't think that's enough. This isn't the obvious choice perhaps, but with Brandon's gap in the lower half and with him not making it up in the back department, I actually have James taking a narrow victory here. He's bringing a much more complete pose, but I'm really not sold either way. Again, a lot of these are close just because they both have issues. And moving to the second back pose, I still don't like them. However, the win here is a bit more apparent. James once again has the bigger, better lower half with virtually no pushback from Brandon. And even though James is narrow, he's still the bigger guy compared to Brandon, and that equals a width advantage for James. Brandon may have good traps, but other than that, he really doesn't have good detail to counteract James's width. But to be fair, James could be tighter and more detailed as well. But with that said, that's pretty much it. Brandon gets beaten width and the lower body, making this one of the more conclusive wins of the comparison. It's still not a slam dunk, I don't think any of these poses are, but this is a solid showing from James. But once again, we have a better pose for both guys. These guys are so much stronger from the side than any angle, which makes sense and it makes for a competitive pose. Starting with the side leg, once again, I actually like Curry here more now. I really like the Dorian style execution from James, but a common pitfall when doing that is the flattening out of the side leg, which James does not evade. Brandon is actually drier knee to glute and more separated, and once again his legs are not weak from this angle, so he wins. Then both guys actually sport decent midsections here. Brandon crunches down and showcases good abs, while James just remains streamlined but leaves the ab detail on the table. I think Brandon is streamlined enough and has the added abs thrown in there, so he wins here narrowly too. You also get full pectorals on each guy, so you can take your pick here as well. And finally in the arm, both guys are really thick, but James has a slightly better tricep. That's by an extremely small margin though, and the angle of Curry's photo isn't helping him any. For a change, we actually get most of everything one could want out of this pose. I'd be fine with either guy winning. James is big and probably looks bigger in real life, but based on what I can see here, I actually prefer Curry. He has the better details overall, from side legs to the midsection, and plenty of size. This will be a 1-point win as it's close, but it's because both guys are actually good. Unfortunately for us though, we are right back to pretty bad poses, and for this one, I do mean bad. We're scraping the bottom of the barrel with the abs and thighs. Now, as much as Brandon sucks, I still think he takes the smallest of small wins here by default. Yes, of course James wins the thighs half of the pose easily, it's not even a comparison. Brandon would have better luck putting his off-season legs up here to get some better size. But really, would we even be able to tell the difference condition-wise if he did? But that's whatever. What about the other half of the pose? This is where James royally up. James barely has abs, they're completely unsymmetrical and very shallow. But Brandon's over there in the corner with some of the worst condition I've seen in a while from a guy of his caliber. However, he still manages to bring out some ab detail to speak of, and his waist is much smaller. James's abs aren't the only bad thing, he also has very poor taper. So yeah, no one is really winning this one, but I think it's safe to say that James is the bigger loser, but Curry is so lackluster that he'll only be scraping by with a single point victory. And finally, we have the most muscular, and luckily we get to end things on a pretty good note considering some of the absolute dog we had to sift through. Even though this is one of the better poses, both of these guys still have notable flaws within their shots. Brandon's legs are awful and James's are the highlight of his own pose. But James has those very poor abs on display yet again, and I'm also missing those finer details from his physique. Yes, he's in condition, but he just doesn't have the most details. Brandon is the opposite. He's not in very good condition at all, we know that, but genetically he has all these shoulder fibers, chest striations, and so on. Brandon also looks a little more like his old self in this shot. He has a good amount of that 3D look and that thickness from previous years. With that okay level of size in the chest, delts, and arms and the superior detail, I think he does enough to beat James here. It's not the most convincing win because he is smaller than James overall, and Brandon has the leg issue, but that upper body is just so damn impressive, even to this day. But let's take a look at one more variation since we have it for both guys. Both guys actually have their main weaknesses being taken out of this one because in the crab, the legs and the abs are both downplayed. But now we're just focusing on the upper body, and that is how Curry won the last shot, and that's how he'll win this one. James still has a lot of overall mass, but Brandon looks just as thick here. It's like his prime Brandon pose. And the details are what seals it for him yet again. Who would have thought? Now overall, for the amount of points he'll get, I think for both variations by themselves are kind of close-ish, but Brandon won them both. But the way I see it, 1 + 1 is 2. So Brandon will be ending the mandatories round with a solid 2-point win. That brings us to the second round of judging, where we take a look at the 4 overall physique categories. We're examining the whole physiques based on flaws, conditioning, shape, and of course muscularity. Let's first start with condition, which is probably the easiest one to determine. James wins. He's not perfect because he almost never peaks perfectly, and he does have some spots that are water and need more detail, particularly in the back, but Brandon really drops the ball here. Even though James is never 100% peeled and wasn't in the version we used today, because Brandon is so bad, I still contemplated giving James the 3 points. I'll show some restraint, but I want all of you to recognize my generosity in the comments. Next, we have another category that turns into a bigger win, not because of the winner being good, but because the loser is so poor. We have muscularity next, and James is winning. That's the baseline. He's bigger, especially now that Brandon is a smaller version of himself, and at this point, because of one thing, James is pretty much just as complete as Brandon. And that one thing is the lower body. And honestly, it's such a huge drop off that it's what takes what was just a 1-point win for James and bumps it to 2 points. Not only is James bigger, but he is far more complete and well-rounded when you consider Brandon's legs. Then we have shape, which has Brandon as the clear winner. James's structure was worse from the get-go. He had the wider waist and the narrower shoulders, and that's never a good combo. Brandon, on the other hand, has really good shape, even though it is kind of deteriorating along with other aspects of his physique. He's still good enough to get a strong 2 points here against James, but at this point, he's just not completely slamming the door. And finally, that brings us to flaws. Honestly, I think everything is pretty well accounted for. We talked about Brandon's legs, condition, James's shape. I don't really think I have anything extra to put here. Not that they don't have small nitpicks for me, but I see them on pretty even ground, so this last category will remain a tie. That brings us to the end of the comparison, and I told you this one would be interesting. Both guys are very flawed at this point, but Brandon Curry was still able to come out ahead, winning 59.6 points to James's 40.4. Now, do not ask me how this happened because I have no idea. Usually I give you some concluding thoughts here, but I pretty much have none for this video. Brandon's win just kind of materialized out of nowhere. Going into this matchup, I actually thought I would have James winning. I thought I was going to have to make a really controversial call. On paper, it just seems so odd. Brandon has poor condition, the legs are very poor at this point, and even Brandon's highlights like the chest, delts, and arms just aren't what they used to be. But to put it bluntly, there are levels to the sport, and Brandon is still higher than James. I mean no disrespect to James when I say this, but he's never going to win the Olympia, and he probably won't win an Arnold either. That doesn't mean he can't or doesn't have a good career, but if you take a look at the guys that win these big titles versus their peers, they are just often superior genetically. When you look at Brandon, even to this day, you can tell that he's a decorated veteran of the sport, without even knowing his competition history. He just has that it factor, not even wow factor. There's just something that some guys have over so many others. I think maybe it has something to do with the level of depth to Brandon's physique and the leftover quality he has from his prime years, but other than that, I really can't provide an explanation. The same outcome actually goes for my prediction as well. Even though James looks great in updates and Brandon doesn't impress me at all in his, I'm going with Curry to place higher. Other than that though, I really have nothing to say. I've seen enough. I counted Brandon out for this matchup, but I called the poses and categories as I saw them, and that transpired into a very eye-opening win for the 15th man. Well, that's going to do it for today's video. What did you guys think of this matchup? Go ahead and leave me your thoughts down in the comments. And if you like this video, hit that like button, subscribe for more. And if you guys are in need of some high quality supplements and want to support the channel even further, be sure to head over to Arms Race Nutrition. Then at checkout, use my code Project10 for 10% off your entire order. That's code Project10 at armsracenutrition.com. And finally, with all that said, I want to thank you guys for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.
Gotta get that Lexia.